If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's what Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said at the World Economic Forum a few days ago. And frankly, I tend to agree with him. And I think his speech at Davos this week was one of the most direct and realistic assessments that we've heard from any Western leader in quite some time. Carney said, "We're not in a transition, we're in a rupture. And middle powers need to stop behaving as though the old system still works the way that it used to." He illustrated this with a story from Václav Havel, who was a famous Czech dissident and later the president of the Czech Republic after the fall of communism. Havel's one of my heroes. Anyway, the story goes like this. A shopkeeper in communist Czechoslovakia puts a sign in his window every morning, and it says, "Workers of the world unite." The shopkeeper doesn't believe it. In fact, nobody does, but he displays it anyway because it's easier to comply than to invite trouble. Havel's point was that systems like this persist not only through force, but through routine participation in ideas that people privately know are untrue. Carney's argument is that middle powers have been doing something similar internationally. For decades, countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many others have benefited from what we call the rules-based international order. Trade was predictable, markets were relatively open, and security guarantees reduced our risk. Now, at the same time, it was clear that enforcement was uneven and that the strongest countries carved out exceptions when it suited them. But we tolerated these inconsistencies because the overall system still delivered stability for us. Carney's point is that this bargain has now broken down. Economic integration, which lifted millions of people out of poverty after World War II, is now being used as a source of pressure. Tariffs are being applied strategically and at times apparently just on a whim. Financial infrastructure is getting leveraged for coercion. Supply chains are getting treated as vulnerabilities. So in that environment, continuing to depend on one or two key players becomes a liability rather than a safeguard. And so countries are responding in ways that are entirely rational. They're seeking more autonomy in energy, in food, in critical minerals, finance, and supply chains. Now, Carney was also pretty explicit about the risks that this creates. A world organized around self-sufficiency and economic fortresses would be poorer and more fragile. But he's also really clear about the mistake that middle powers cannot afford to make. When they negotiate alone with much larger powers, outcomes are shaped by leverage rather than choice. And this is where his line from Davos matters. Middle powers need to act together because if they're not present in shaping outcomes, decisions are made without them. And this isn't just language. You can see it play out in how trade decisions actually get made. Large economies can absorb friction and dictate terms for longer periods of time. Middle powers just can't. And that's why Canada is pursuing what Carney described as values-based realism. Commitment to sovereignty, territorial integrity, and human rights combined with an acceptance that progress is incremental and interests are going to diverge. And so in practice, that means broader engagement, diversified trade relationships, and conditions built around specific issues rather than some kind of abstract universality. Carney was also really direct about expectation. The old order, he said, is not coming back. And I think he could be right. Waiting for it to reemerge is not going to reduce risk. What could replace it, though, is a denser network of trade, investment, and security relationships among countries that understand that they can't rely on a single guarantor. So from Canada's perspective, this approach reflects basic risk management. Exposure is reduced. Options are increased. Leverage is distributed rather than concentrated tightly. And that logic sits very squarely in the world of trade, not in the world of ideology. And it also explains why Canada's recent move makes sense once you stop assuming that the old system still provides protection. So that's why I agree with Mark Carney, because in a system shaped by power and pressure, refusing to acknowledge reality doesn't preserve stability. It just increases vulnerability. What's your take?